to have you with us here on this Tuesday night. And as we come on the air tonight, the emergency unfolding across several states. Millions without electricity in Texas and elsewhere across the South. No heat, no water after this first storm, and it's been deadly. At least 15 dead. The family members discovered trying to stay warm in their garage. Several dead after tornadoes as well in North Carolina and in Georgia. One was an EF3, winds 160 miles per hour. And this is all about to get worse. Already the coldest temperatures in more than a century. Now the second storm set to move right across the country, hitting the same states yet again and then right up into the Northeast. And look at this image tonight. This is not the middle of the country or the Northeast. This is Houston. Snow-covered neighborhoods. This is the Westbury neighborhood, right up through the middle of the country. Tractor trailers pulling off I-75. This is Lima, Ohio, because of blinding snow there. 1.5 feet of new snow near Chicago, and tonight the most dangerous impact across the country, the power outages in at least 13 states tonight. Some 4 million without power, and this image right here sparking anger in Texas tonight. Houston skyscrapers brilliantly lit, while neighborhoods surrounding downtown are in the dark. Families without heat, without power. At least 140 cases of carbon monoxide poisoning in Houston alone. That woman and an 8-year-old girl dying after authorities say they were trying to stay warm using the car in the garage. And the tornadoes I mentioned, the warnings as we came on the air last night here, and so far at least 5 reported tornadoes. That confirmed EF3 in Brunswick County, North Carolina, killing 3. All of this, of course, halting vaccinations as well as millions already suffering with no power. Now prepare for this next storm. ABC's Marcus Moore leading us off tonight from Texas.
Tonight, millions without power for a second day in Texas, and the death toll is rising. In Galveston County, officials are preparing for the worst, asking the state to bring in refrigerated trucks that can hold as many as 50 bodies.
We're not projecting anything, but I'm afraid that I don't have a whole lot of room for optimism here.
The coldest temperatures in parts of the state in more than 100 years is bursting pipes and damaging homes while families shiver inside. In Houston, a woman and an 8-year-old girl dying of carbon monoxide poisoning after a car was left running in a garage to help generate heat. A man and a 7-year-old boy taken to the hospital.
I know it's cold, but you got to be careful about using, like, say, generators or a car inside a garage or any type of fire, carbon monoxide. It's odorless and it can kill people very easily.
Houston hospitals treating at least 140 patients. 6 people from one family among them, a mother and a child in critical condition. They were heating charcoals indoors to stay warm. And in Sugar Land, a grandmother and...
Tonight, the end of the Texas deep freeze, turning one crisis into another.
Hearing multiple calls saying that the roof is on fire.
Overnight, flames tore through a Killeen hotel. The fire made even worse by a failed sprinkler system, damaged when it froze. The water issue still impacting more than 14 million Texans, now forced to boil or find bottled water till supply is deemed safe.
We don't have any drinking water, any flushing water, any washing water, any water. I need the water pretty badly.
Today, President Biden approved an emergency disaster declaration offering grants for temporary housing and loans to repair property damage for 77 hard-hit counties. But Texas officials say it's not enough.
Governor Abbott asked for a major disaster declaration for all 254 Texas counties for both individual assistance and public assistance.
This is what Bantu Segal and his wife Paulina came home to, a burst pipe flooding their downstairs.
Water went into those walls, and our biggest worry is mold for our kids, with anything with moisture related.
The couple unaware of the damage until they got home from the hospital, where both worked long hours treating patients, many who lost power for slips and accidents on ice.
We can land spaceships on Mars, but we can't figure out how to get energy to communities in Texas. It's quite frustrating.
Frustration shared statewide. With the extreme weather, energy prices soared. Now, residents who had power reporting energy bills in the thousands. The governor holding an emergency meeting tonight to address it. In Austin, nearly 40% of the city lost power for multiple days.
This is a catastrophic failure.
A catastrophic cost, too. The freeze on its way to surpassing Hurricane Harvey as the state's costliest weather event in history. For the millions still without water and countless others picking up the pieces, help can't come fast enough.
And Morgan joins us now from Dallas. Morgan, any idea when this water disaster will be resolved?
Yeah, Jose, even with millions facing those compromised water supplies, it is important to note progress is being made. Local communities are lifting those boil notices by the hour.
Demonstrators have clashed with riot police during a fifth night of protests in Barcelona. Tear gas was fired in an attempt to disperse the crowds as protesters smashed windows, looted shops and set bins and motorbikes alight. They've taken to the streets in anger over the arrest of a rapper at the centre of a free speech controversy. Pablo Esel was detained by police on Tuesday following a 24-hour standoff at a university building. The 32-year-old is now serving a 9-month sentence after being convicted for insulting the Spanish monarchy and praising terrorism. Largely peaceful protests calling for his release have been held in several cities, but they've descended into chaos in Barcelona. Earlier on Saturday, residents there expressed frustration at the damage caused by the unrest.
Nada bueno. Esto no puede ser. Está todo destruido, todo quemado, huele a plástico todas las noches, helicópteros. Ya estamos un poquito hartos, la verdad.
Yo la violencia no estoy de acuerdo. Cuando rompen y hacen estragos, eso ya no tiene ninguna justificación.
The case has sparked a national debate over free speech amid calls for a change in the country's so-called gag law. The government has since announced it will scrap prison terms for offences involving freedom of expression, but the proposed amendments won't affect the rapper's sentence.
At the hospital in Kagara, doctors and nurses treat wounded students and teachers. And at the Kagara Science College, concerned parents gather for news. Elsewhere in town, security stepped up, just as the state government ordered the closure of schools in those areas prone to attacks. Schools are increasingly targeted as they offer an opportunity to take many students hostage.
In Nigeria, there's totally absence of local government administration, which has become very difficult for the locals to have anyone to run to. Another thing here is that there is also a porous border surrounding most parts of that area. If you look at what is happening internationally, like in places like Chad, in Cameroon, especially in southern Cameroon, these countries have not been able to hold the security military onslaught for too long.
This is the second major school kidnapping in as many months. In December last year, gunmen stormed a school and abducted hundreds of students in President Buhari's home state of Katsina. But 6 years before that, in 2014, in a case that made headlines around the world, more than 270 girls were snatched from a school in Chibok. At least 100 are still unaccounted for. The armed group Boko Haram claimed responsibility. And 4 years after that, in neighboring Yobe state, the group took more than 100 students from a school in Dapchi. Kidnapping for ransom is now big business in Nigeria. From the north down to the country's south, hundreds of Nigerians are kidnapped every week for ransom. And despite military offensives against what officials here call bandits, the problem continues to grow. On Monday, 18 passengers were seized while traveling in a bus near Yakila, not far from where the latest kidnapping took place. 8 have since managed to secure their freedom. Although there are no official statistics, it's estimated $20 million was paid in ransom money in 2020 to kidnappers. And this in a country, Africa's largest economy, where poverty is on the increase. Ahmed Idris, Al Jazeera, Abuja.
Hours after the arrival of 80,000 doses of the Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine, South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, was one of the first to get the jab. The government says it wants to allay fears.
This day represents a real milestone for us as South Africans, that finally the vaccines are here and they are being administered. And I was rather pleased that there were 5 people who were vaccinated before me, and they are health workers.
This consignment is one of 4 expected in the coming weeks. The government says it plans to administer up to 500,000 of the single-dose vaccines as part of a study mainly targeting healthcare workers. South Africa's bought 7 million more doses for use later in the year. At this vaccine centre in Soweto, 28 healthcare workers have registered for their shots. Henri van Niekerk works in the COVID-19 ward at the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital.
The whole world has been crippled by this disease, and I see disease and death with it because of it every single day. So this is just a step in the right direction.
The Johnson & Johnson jab has shown it's almost 60% effective against moderate to severe illness caused by a new, more contagious variant identified in South Africa. While it's not yet been approved elsewhere, South Africa's Health Products Regulatory Authority has allowed its use for research. But many people, including in the health service, remain skeptical.
The reality is that there's very different levels of understanding. There's obviously a lot of fear associated with the vaccine because of the confusion with the initial one being approved and then moving on to another vaccine. So staff have been very confused.
In February, South Africa suspended its planned rollout of the AstraZeneca vaccine. A local study had shown it didn't provide enough protection against the new variant. Once health and essential workers and the vulnerable are vaccinated, the rollout's expected to be extended to the general public. And getting everyone on board is where the government may face its greatest challenge. It hopes to vaccinate 2/3 of the population with about 40 million doses of vaccine to achieve the so-called herd immunity. But it may be many months before South Africa manages to reach that target. Famida Miller, Al Jazeera.
Ford, one of the world's biggest car manufacturers, announces a $1 billion centre to build electric cars for all over Europe. The plant in the German city of Cologne comes with a promise that Ford's entire range of new European cars will be electric by 2030. Behind all the glitz of the big motor companies competing with each other in a race to go green is a grim reality. Europe has had a dreadful record for pollution for many years. New research published in the Lancet Planetary Health Journal says more than 50,000 deaths a year from the effects of pollution could be prevented if World Health Organization guidelines on air quality were met. Many analysts believe the limits and the carbon neutral goals set for European governments are too low.
My concern is, in fact, they need to go faster. If you consider the implications of climate catastrophe, the climate emergency that we're living through right now, the impacts of air pollution on human health, on plant health, things like that, there's a lot more that we ought to be doing.
Replacing cars with electric power instead of petrol and diesel is crucial for countries to get even close to their emissions targets. Across Europe, there's a wide variation of approaches to EVs, electric vehicles. The big manufacturers are now clamouring for a market share, but there are problems.
The three common barriers to EV ownership are always the same three things. They're the initial purchase price of the car, their perception of range anxiety, and the perception that there are not enough charging points.
Like this? Another aspect is what gives the electric cars their power. For now, it's a lithium-ion battery. There's a vast scale of production needed, but so far Europe only has some factories being built in Sweden and Germany. Europe makes 3% of batteries, while Asia, led by China and South Korea, manufactures 85% of them. Alongside the zero carbon targets and new technology, it's the human attitude that's key to success or failure. Campaigners know there's a need to go beyond street protests to capture hearts and minds, and more governments are using enforcement rather than encouragement. There's one standout figure in statistics, though. An estimated $5 trillion of investment a year goes into fossil fuels. Andrew Simmons, Al Jazeera.
I'm going to sign in, that's what we do while you're...
It was the third executive order signed by Joe Biden.
The commitment I made that we're going to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord as of today.
The Biden administration has vowed to reverse Donald Trump's extraordinary rollback of environmental safeguards, some 100 rules over the last 4 years, including emission standards for cars, power plants, and the oil and gas industry, all seen as key to saving the planet.
We're getting out
President Trump announced the US's withdrawal from the Paris Accord in 2017. However, due to a strict exit timetable stipulated in the agreement, the US only officially withdrew 3.5 years later, the day after Trump lost the election. Nonetheless, it was an announcement symbolic of the irreversible damage wrought on the planet by the US over the last 4 years.
It did have incredible ramifications domestically and globally. We are on an actual emergency timescale. We need to actually transition our entire electricity system by 80% reductions in emissions by 2030. So every day that we are delaying that, we are exacerbating the climate emergency.
The Paris Accord, agreed to by the Obama administration in 2015, committed the US to a 28% cut of greenhouse gas emissions from 2005 levels by 2025. At the time, scientists said it was an inadequate pledge if the goal was keeping the global temperature from rising over 2 degrees Celsius from pre-industrial times. Any larger rise and planetary catastrophe is predicted. Now it may also take several years to reverse Trump's regulatory rollbacks, crucial time that the planet doesn't have. Biden envisions a carbon-neutral US by 2050, but given the damage of the last 4 years, members of Congress argue Biden will have to take bold action himself.
I think it might be a good idea for President Biden to call a climate emergency.
Why?
Because then it relates to what you're saying. Then he can do many, many things under the emergency powers of the president that wouldn't have to go through, that he could do without legislation. Now, Trump used this emergency for a stupid wall, which wasn't an emergency. But if there ever was an emergency, climate is one.
The president could end fracking or kickstart the US's alternative energy industry through executive action far quicker than it would take for Congress to formulate legislation. Scientists warn every day the US delays, the closer the Earth is to catastrophe. Yes, using presidential and not congressional power means that a future president not concerned with climate change could reverse Biden's policies. But proponents of declaring a climate emergency argue that if the focus of the executive actions is to fundamentally change the US's economy and infrastructure, the impact of those policies may not be reversed. Shia Bratansi, Al Jazeera, Washington.
The rain and snow didn't deter this rally against Armenia's prime minister. Protesters say Nikol Pashinyan is a traitor who should resign. They accuse him of mishandling last year's war with Azerbaijan, an unforgivable action, they say, that deserves punishment. The peace deal ended fighting in the region of Nagorno-Karabakh, and it also gave back land to Azerbaijan. Ever since, thousands of Armenians have been outraged.
I demand his resignation. He sold my country and I lost my homeland because of him. There's been several opposition protests since last year, but we want concrete action to follow.
The prime minister has resisted pressure to step down, but that pressure is mounting. He was elected in 2018 after leading a movement against corruption and a weak economy. But 3 years later, his own opposition now wants him out.
Our culture, education, and even our homeland borders are under threat. One way or another, he must resign.
The prime minister has defended his actions, even though Armenia appears to still be on the losing end.
Unfortunately, we didn't manage to solve the issue of war prisoners, which is the most sensitive and the most complicated.
As part of the Moscow-brokered deal, ethnic Armenians handed back land they had controlled since the 1990s. Azerbaijan says the deal was long overdue. Armenians call it humiliating. 6 weeks of fighting in 2020 led to about 6,000 deaths on both sides. Even though the fighting has ended, the prime minister's political battle is far from over. Katia Lopez-Odoyan, Al Jazeera.
Around the world, make sure everybody gets the vaccines that they need so that the whole world can come through this pandemic together. And I know that several colleagues have already announced that ideal, and we in the UK strongly support it. And of course, we also want to work together on building back better from the pandemic. I think that this is the right moment there for us all to focus on the other great natural challenge about which we've been warned time and time and time again. We can't ignore it. The warnings have been even clearer than they were for COVID, and that is the problem of climate change.
Australia wants to regulate Facebook. In return, it's got a news blackout. Facebook scrubbed its news feed, wiping information from health pages, government agencies, welfare networks and weather warnings. The government wants to bring in a law that forces Facebook and Google to pay media outlets when they republish their content. Google has conceded, signing deals with several media outlets, but Facebook has not.
Facebook was wrong. Facebook's actions were unnecessary. They were heavy-handed and they will damage its reputation here in Australia.
Facebook announced the move on its blog, saying Australia misunderstands the relationship between itself and publishers. It says publishers willingly choose to post news on Facebook to sell more subscriptions, grow their audiences and increase advertising revenue. It estimates it generated more than 5 billion free referrals to Australian publishers, worth an estimated $315 million last year. The government and Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg talked again on Thursday.
The principle is very clear. Google and Facebook are important parts of the digital ecosystem in Australia. They're important parts of the economy. We've made it clear that we want them to continue operating here, but we've also made it clear that if you do business in Australia, you need to comply with the law of the land in Australia.
Many in the media agree, arguing tech giants must pay for the journalism they republish.
Well, of course, news organisations use whatever platform they can to share their content. The problem is that what this has meant is Google and Facebook now take the lion's share of advertising revenue, which makes it very difficult for media companies to employ the journalists, our members, that need to bring quality news.
Human Rights Watch also condemned the move, saying Facebook has cut off more than the media.
Vulnerable Australians are the ones caught in the middle here, because whilst this law is aimed at news companies, there are a whole range of community organisations who've been affected.
Australia has given Google and Facebook two options: strike deals with media companies or have fees set for them. But Facebook has decided on a third: take away its newsfeed altogether. Charlotte Bellis, Al Jazeera.
Every day the fear is that this might be the last day that we could do our job. Many of my former colleagues have not slept at their homes since the coup. There's a lot of young journalists risking their lives to try and get news of what's happening in Myanmar out to us now.
You would see these videos and hear these pots and pans being drummed really loudly, and in Myanmar tradition you do that to scare away the evil, and we know who that is.
She's talking about the junta, Myanmar's new military regime. Those two words, junta and regime, are now banned from being broadcast or published in the country. The new military authorities are picking up where the last regime left off in 2011, when it surrendered just some of its powers to civilians. They're out to control the information flow. There have been some 500 arrests, journalists included, the bulk of them during police raids at night, a tactic used by the old regime. So if you're a reporter or just have an opinion on social media, sleep doesn't come easy. A new cybersecurity law is in the works to police dissent online when citizens can get online, in between the rolling internet blackouts that come at the flick of a switch.
There's definitely a move by the military in order to criminalize all dissent, whether that is people in the streets, people who are participating in the civil disobedience movement, or the media. A really good example of how the military sees its relationship with the public is the fact that there is a department in the military called the Directorate of Public Relations and Psychological Warfare.
It's always worth remembering that it was only a decade or so ago that the military was handing sort of 27-year sentences to young independent journalists. It has a very recent history of severe punishment of anyone seen to be scrutinizing and publicizing its abuses. And I think there is a real threat now that Myanmar is moving back towards the era when any form of opposition was seen as criminal.
If you were watching the state-run channels right now, like MRTV and Myawaddy, you'd be seeing a lot of military propaganda and probably no protests at all.
ချိန်ချောက်ခြင်းများထိဥပဒေကိုချိုးဖောက်မှုအချို့ရှိလာခဲ့ပါသည်။စည်းကမ်းမရှိရင်ဒီမိုကရေစီပျက်စီးနိုင်ပါသည်
Everything would be wonderful and everyone would be super pleased that a military basically seized power of an elected government.
နိုင်ငံတော်စီမံအုပ်ချုပ်ရေးကောင်စီလက်ထက်ကြောင့်မှကျွန်တော်တို့ကကြိုဆိုတဲ့အနေနဲ့ပထမဆုံးရှင်းလင်းတဲ့သတင်းစာရှင်းလင်းပွဲကိုလာရောက်သတင်းရယူခြင်းဖြစ်ကြောင်းကိုပြောချင်ပါတယ်
They're grasping at straws because they're not just targeting journalists anymore. They're actually trying to target the whole population who they know are rebelling, essentially.
Since 2011 and the return to civilian rule in Myanmar, the military has remained uncomfortably close to power, pulling the strings from behind the scenes on policies like the persecution of Rohingya Muslims. Prior to that, the army had ruled the country on its own for almost half a century. Dissent was not tolerated, censorship was a fact of life. But the junta's authoritarian playbook is in need of an update. The country and its people have changed.
Myanmar is now connected, and the new generation is so much more savvier when it comes to using social media and technology. They understand the importance of memes, a good slogan, and even, the use of this three-finger salute from the Hunger Games. A lot of that, organizing was done on social media, and that's critical because the military, what they want is the world to forget about Myanmar. It's a tiny nation, just ignore us. What the young people are trying to do is to make that job really difficult by keeping Myanmar in the news.
They're coming out to protest this as, effectively a Gen Z-driven civil disobedience movement. They've grown up in pretty much regime conditions, only to then have this taste of freedom where they have access to international news, information, and I do understand some other people's fears that perhaps they're a bit naive and once the shooting starts, then they'll see how absolutely draconian this regime could be. But what other choice do they have? This is their future. They don't want anyone to take it away from them.
For millions of people in Myanmar, Facebook is the internet. It's that dominant a platform. In 2012 and 2013, the company started getting complaints that it was being used to spread hate, pitting the majority Buddhist community against the Rohingya Muslim minority. Facebook was scandalously slow to intervene. Hundreds of thousands were forced out of Myanmar in what the UN described as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. Eventually, the platform picked up its game. By 2018, it had banned the Army's Commander-in-Chief, General Mae Un Lay, for allegedly enabling or committing serious human rights abuses. It also banned the Army-owned Myawaddy TV channel. That same general now leads the junta. Facebook continues to ban him. And since the coup, the platform says it has cut distribution from all military accounts for spreading misinformation.
The military has never liked independent-minded media or journalists. They also have a history of hiring people who spread disinformation. They've been gaslighting the whole nation for decades. And we can expect that they're going to use all sorts of these tactics, intimidation, harassment, lawsuits, and put pressure on the media.
The military's ability to communicate with the public is complicated by the fact that they're essentially banned off of Facebook. It comes at a time when people are not really reading newspapers as much. Not everyone necessarily owns a television, and it's quite likely that a number of people are going to boycott state-controlled media. I think that's an especially pertinent thing, considering that having a monopoly on information is really what gave the military a lot of control in the past, in addition to their weapons.